And welcome everyone. I'm Christy Burke, a senior leader here at Zoom. We have a special panel discussion for you today, all about something that's shaping how we work, the multi-generational workforce. I'm thrilled to be joined by two industry experts, Maya Ervin and Tim Oldman. Thank you both for being here. I want to start by having you introduce yourself. Maya, let's begin with you.
Hello, thank you so much, Christy, for having us. I'm Maya Ervin. I am formerly the Chief People Officer and Chief Impact Officer for Juve Consulting, which is what Refinery 29 called the largest Gen Z marketing collective. But Juve is no longer a thing. We were acquired, so I am now operating as executive of Next Gen under United Talent Agency, under their entertainment and culture marketing team.
Great, thank you, Maya. And Tim?
Hi, Christy. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Tim Oldman. I'm the founder of a thing called the Leesman Index, which is the world's largest appraisal tool, benchmarking tool of employee workplace experience. So I've, for 14 years, been totally obsessed with the experience that anybody in any generation, any demography, how they experience the places of work provided for them.
Great. Thank you, Tim. All right, let's get things started. So kicking things off, each generation has its own traits, preferred way of working, communication styles, and non-negotiables. How do different generations define a positive employee experience, and are there commonalities across the generations? Maya, I'll have us start with you.
Yeah, for sure. There are certainly commonalities. I know that that's something I talk a lot about when I do sort of speeches like this, because folks always bring up the fact, like, we're all people, we all want the same things. And to an extent, that is true. We do want a lot of the same things. Like, we all want a well-paying job. I think we can all agree that we don't want to work most of the day, like in terms of, the 24 hours within a day. We want stability, we want great benefit. Those are all things that are relatively similar across the board. But because generations are usually grouped together by shared experiences, those shared experiences often shape what our expectations are, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. So for our baby boomers, they're really valuing hard work. They really value paying your dues, so working your way up to the top, which I know is often a conversation that is brought up as it pertains to this generation, Gen Z. They're not necessarily looking for constant feedback, but they value structure, clear goals, specific deadlines, and often are retained through rewards, professional development, and opportunities and bonuses. Whereas our Gen Xers are a bit more skeptical of authority, but value diversity and personal development, but also value efficiency and flexibility. They like to be engaged with clear and immediate feedback as well, which is another similarity, but often retained through a collaborative environment and having a meaningful work experience. And they're also the latchkey generation. So that's also why there's a sense of autonomy when it comes to Gen Xers. And then our millennials, of course, some of us are probably a bit more familiar, valuing work-life balance, valuing a sense of belonging, and having a greater purpose as it pertains to work, and of course, hybrid workplaces. And then our Gen Zers, there's a lot on that list. We have a few non-negotiables. We value flexibility, we value being autonomous, but I think the biggest thing for us is empathy and a humane leadership. Empathy ranked as number 2 is the second most important thing for Gen Zers as it pertains to traits a manager should have. So for us, I think that those are the things that really are super important for us in the workplace.
Great. Thank you, Maya. And Tim, we'd love to hear what you're seeing.
Well, I think unless you're hearing it from Maya in terms of an expert on generational differences, personally, I prefer not to label people with the traditional generational badges. I think, if we think that a generation is measured typically between sort of 25 to 30 years in terms of a generational group, I think what we're talking about really is just evolution. I think as people come through their working lives, they start to develop different approaches and different attitudes, and the economic atmosphere changes, our expectations change. So I think a lot of what Maya talks to is absolutely without any disagreement at all. But I think I find it sometimes that other organizations who aren't as generous with the sort of investigation of the differences and the similarities, they risk identifying sort of too formulaic traits to any one of those groups. So I'd prefer to talk about people's life stage, or their journey through an organization, through their career stage. And certainly from the Leesman perspective, looking at a sample of maybe 1 million employees or thereabouts, what we would tend to see is the bigger differences are not about when you were born, but actually the role that you're in. So the more complex your role, the more things you need of the workplace. And the more pressure you're under, the more you get into your 30s. So it's like life stage and career stage are a much greater and more accurate determiner of your workplace needs, your physical, environmental space needs, than anything to do very specifically with the year you were born.
Wow, thank you. Very, very interesting perspective. Love the correlation between the two. All right, if we look at communication styles, preferred communication styles can vary among individuals within each generation, but there are definitely some tendencies that are associated with the different age groups. So Maya, if we look to you, in what ways do communication preferences differ among generations, and how do you see that impacting collaboration within the teams?
That is a great question. I love this question, especially because I'm kind of experiencing this in real time right now. As I mentioned earlier, Juve Consulting, which was the organization prior to being acquired, has now since been acquired by UTA. So we're sort of going through in real time, sort of an intergenerational like combination or evolution, if you will. And this has been proven amongst the cohort that Gen Z's communication style, of course, is influenced by the fact that we are social media natives and we are constantly on social media platforms and utilizing instant message platforms, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's Snapchat. The younger generation, the younger Gen Zers, as well as Gen Alpha, often use Snapchat as a way to communicate with their friends. So of course, that's sort of what we're used to and what we sort of gravitate to in the workplace. So going to platforms that are more similar to those, like a Slack. Prior to being acquired, we used Workplace, or the platforms and the methods of communication that we prefer. And we actually see that Gen Z is struggling with communicating via email due to its sort of formal nature, and often actually stresses us out because it's so formal and we're so used to bringing that colloquial lingo from social media, from TikTok, from our everyday lives to the workplace. I communicate to at least my Gen Z coworkers, not necessarily the ones who aren't Gen Z. I definitely communicate to my other Gen Z coworkers through TikTok lingo, through TikTok audios, even in the workplace. So that is definitely something to be cognizant of, and also be cognizant of the fact that Gen Z slang or Gen Z lingo isn't actually a thing. A lot of Gen Z slang and lingo is actually appropriated from other cultures. So whether that is Black and queer spaces, whether that's ballroom culture, etc. So that's also a note to be aware of as people are around each other and start picking up on each other's lingo. We have to be aware of where those origins are as well.
Wow, interesting. Now I'm going to pause when I send an email. I'm really going to think about who I'm sending what to. Tim, I'd love to hear your view.
Yeah, well, Maya's absolutely right. You know, again, I would, rather than the generational badge, I would say the age of the person the year of birth there relates to the familiarity with multi-channel communication that they're much more comfortable with. And look, I put my hands up to it. I would prefer one email channel, one conversation channel in my team. And I know they're off having their chats in other arenas, right? So it's just, I, as somebody in the upper age groups, have to be more comfortable with what's happening behind me. There's no issue with that. I think that where the sort of dichotomy is, and Maya's absolutely right, I think there is more empathy, more emotional intelligence, more emotional awareness in those younger generations. But actually, one of the things around emotional intelligence is being able to mirror behaviors. So I think, to Maya's point, if Maya were communicating with somebody right at the head of the business that she now finds herself in, who might be 2 generations above her, then I would have an expectation that anybody in the younger groups has developed a better sense of how to adjust their communication style. So I have no problem being multi-channel. What I'm looking for, I think, is just that they use that emotional intelligence that we all recognize they've developed, and they tune it in more accurately. And I think that's where there's a little bit of, it's almost like reticence, I think I see in a lot of that group at the moment. There's like a reticence to say, why should I have to mirror behavior of you up there? Why can't you be more accommodating to our communication styles down here? So I think I'm looking for a little bit more sort of elasticity and multi-directional sort of communication skills, albeit that I'm still going to prefer 1 or 2 or maybe 3 channels, not 50 or 60 channels, right? So that's where I'm at.
So as I look at my desktop with the 50 or 60 channels plus my email, I really have to think about that, right? In terms of what communication looks like throughout the day.
It's almost like actually thinking about them as different languages. Maya said this, there are languages, because we are more internationally exposed to many different cultures than we were certainly when I entered the workforce. You know, the only opportunity I had to absorb other cultures was probably, you know, out for an evening in London, or if I had a trip to a foreign country. Now it's like it's coming at you in your palm, constant. So it's amazing in terms of that awareness we have of other cultures and some of the challenges they're facing, some of the lingo and the language that we can adopt from those, that is in many instances a far more accurate way of describing our emotional state. So I'm really supportive of that sort of blending of language and culture. But I think we just have to be aware that then when we're in a channel that uses that language, it isn't always appropriate to then adopt it in another channel. So I don't know, if you're an agent in a contact center and you're receiving a customer call from, I don't know, somebody in their 70s who's been the victim of some cybercrime, I wouldn't expect you to be using the lingo and the slang that you pick up on the streets, right? So I think we're just looking for a professionalism, I guess, in the workspace that is right and proper for the channel that you are find yourself in at that point in your workday.
So now thinking about, Tim, technology, you know, from your view, how has adoption of technology impacted work preferences and expectations of these generations?
I think the one common factor that I see across all generations at the moment is almost like a frustration and an impatience, and I think that comes down to what I consider to be the consumerization of work, right? That actually in our private lives, the access to technology and consumer innovation is immediate. Like I could sit here on my iPhone now and pull in another app that does something different to all the rest of the apps I've got on screen. But in the corporate workplace, for most employees in the knowledge economies, if they wanted to add another application to their desktop, you know, you've got to go through 6 months of R&D testing with the technology teams, right? And that's even then if it's signed off, right? If you want a bigger monitor in a meeting room to have a more immersive experience with your colleagues that you're perfectly happy to work for remotely, you're probably talking about having to send 3 purchase orders to 4 different suppliers and wait 3 months. In the UK, I could go straight onto my phone now and order one that will be delivered to my local supermarket. I could pick it up and have an install team in tomorrow to install it in my front room. So I think that's where the frustration with tech is. It's not to do with any generational aspects. I think we're all sitting at home consuming stuff super fast, and we go to the workplace and it's like we slow down to this sort of, one of my colleagues calls it kayaking through mud. You know, you just like, doesn't matter what effort you put in, you know there's a faster route at home, but you don't seem to be able to get it in the corporate workplace. So that's my take on tech. It's not so much what generation you are, it's actually that we're all commonly find that we can get much better outside of work than we can in work.
Kayaking through mud. I love that. Maya, as a digital native, how do you believe that Gen Z's unique relationship with technology is shaping their expectations in the workplace?
For me, I see social media as really arming this generation with huge amounts of information about an employer before they even get there than maybe what we're used to. Gen Zers use TikTok as Google, as some of y'all may know. Like TikTok is our #1 search engine. So we're going to TikTok to figure out what it's like to work at an organization before we get there. We're going to influencers who may work in that same space, even if it's not the same company, may work in that same space and industry that's like, here's the life of working at a tech company for terrible pay, because sometimes it does get that specific. But we're also looking to future of work influencers to navigate the work landscape. So how do I push back on my boss in a professional but respectful way? How do I advocate for myself in the workplace? How do I know when it's appropriate to ask for a raise? These are narratives that are swirling around online that Gen Zers have large amount of access to, and not just Gen Zers, really anybody have a large amount of access to, but it is proven that this generation is doing a lot of that research before engaging with employers. And I think that this is super important for folks to know because, one, it means that you should be cognizant of the narrative of your organization online, because even if you are not playing a role in shaping that narrative, somebody, if you're a large enough company, of course, is playing a role in shaping that narrative, right? So you might want to actually get into that game, if you will. I always talk about the importance of employer branding. So not just branding to your consumer and the folks that are buying your product, but branding taking a page out of Duolingo's book of who you are as an organization. What does it feel like to work there? Who are the people behind the scenes? Because we do want to see that information. We are doing that research before actually going on an interview, before actually applying. And I think it's also important for folks to know that Gen Zers are sort of getting this information because of the gravitational influence that Gen Zers actually have on the rest of the organization. Edelman did a study where they found that 93% of employees said that their 20-something coworkers influence them on work topics such as like work-life balance, self-advocacy, fair pay, and work as an identity. So even if we feel like, okay, we'll let those people, scroll on the internet because they can believe whatever they want, maybe that is true, but it's actually also showing that what we think on how we show up in the workplace is actually going to affect the rest of your employees, even though we are the youngest cohort in the organization.
So I find this so fascinating. This morning, one of the articles that came across to me was the role of influencers on LinkedIn, which is this phenomenon. And just to your point, like being able to create that brand image, whether it be at an executive level or company level, and just the role that that's playing. So pretty timely.
Yes. And it also influences like how we think about work in the future, like all these new terms that I'm learning about, like squiggly work or like monochromatic work, etc. I'm like, okay, I need to catch up because I'm not even attuned to some of these things, but it is shaping how we think about work and how we look at work in the future for sure.
I think I'm gonna have to go TikTok, squiggly work.
Squiggly work.
Go figure out what that is. All right. So if we took a look at management and obviously approaches in this space, how do managers leverage the perspectives and unique strengths of each of these generations to build a cohesive and high performing team? And Tim, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Look, there isn't a silver bullet. There's no blueprint that Maya or I could give any organization that tells them how to go about it. So the first thing I would say is do the damn hard work yourself. Understand your organization, understand your purpose, understand the why, what it is that the employee is expected. That needs to be communicated quite clearly. I think one thing that I would urge any organization to do is be very clear on purpose, and that's got to be absolutely top down. That North Star, that reason for being, the very reason that an employee rocks up to contribute every day, whether they're doing that from home, from another setting, or they're doing it from a corporate workplace. If they're not clear on what that purpose is organizationally, I think everything else thereafter starts to crumble away, and it gets very hard for anybody in the hierarchies below it to accurately communicate that reason for being, that reason that, if you like, line of sight to achievement, right? So if you're a Zoomer in on, I don't know, you're just in on a placement, like you're age 17, you've managed to grab yourself 6 weeks with an organization over your summer vacation. That individual should clearly understand what their little 6 weeks of work is going to do in contribution to somebody just above them, who's got somebody else above them, who has a bigger role and rolls up sooner or later to the big corporate success. And I think that's what I see lacking in many organizations, a single statement that they can say, this is our hairy, audacious goal. This is our North Star. This is our Simon Sinek why statement. I don't care what it is, but without that, I think it's almost impossible for anybody in the leadership structure below to engage with any one of the demographic bands, any age group, any life stager, to communicate the purpose that they serve within the organization.
So true. Maya, your thoughts?
I 110% agree with Tim. That is one thing that I always tell the clients that I work with, or whether I'm out doing speeches, is what is your why? Because that needs to be backed up by your actions. That needs to be backed up by your decision making. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But having a purpose that everybody in your organization is aware of what that purpose is super important. And I am actually shocked at the amount of times that I go into a company and ask different employees what the company's mission is or purpose is, and you get a bunch of different answers. And that's actually more common than folks expect. But at Juve, for example, our employees knew that we exist to empower young people. Doesn't mean that we always showed up in the right way, but folks knew in what ways they wanted to challenge us because they knew what our mission was supposed to be. We knew what we were supposed to be standing up for in terms of purpose, in terms of how we wanted to show up on social media, in terms of the business decisions that we made, because we knew what the why was. I think Tim is absolutely right. There's no magic key or like blueprint that we can give folks. But what I would encourage everybody to do is understand what motivates people, and even the people within the same generation. Because yes, there are commonalities, but we are all different people that are motivated by different things. Some people want the money, some people want the purpose, some people just want to show up to work because they know it's a part of living and they want to function in other capacities of their life, and they need money to do that. So I think that, of course, we can talk about the a through line within each generation. So like boomers really being connected to work and loving leadership and guidance. So maybe tapping into their strengths and encouraging them to be leaders. Gen Xers, as I mentioned, being the latchkey generation who really is independent, autonomous. Maybe we tap into their entrepreneurial spirit. Is there a new department or practice that you can need assistance with starting up? Millennials loving professional development, which is super important to them. Maybe they're providing mentorship opportunities, water cooler moments to Gen Zers who often say that they view learning and professional development and mentorship as the key to excelling and moving up in the organization. So I think there is an opportunity to tap into each generation's strengths and sort of create value and purpose for them there, which will increase their productivity. But in general, I think it is also important, to Tim's point, to just simply do the damn work, for lack of better words, and figure out what motivates your team.
Yeah, one of the books that I recommend as people are coming up in leadership is The 5 Love Languages of the Workplace. And obviously there's one for personal, but this professional one really helps you tap into and understand each individual person, regardless to your point of generation, because people are people and what motivates all of us, and how to help those folks and ensure that you're leading to each individual strength and person.
I think you're sorry, Christy. And one thing I'd just like to amplify from what Maya was saying, I think from her earlier point, there is so much more information available to the employee now about what their organization does in all sorts of walks of its life. And I think that's one thing I didn't have when I came into the workforce, right? It was like, the company accounts, you weren't allowed anywhere near them, right? The remuneration of your executives, you had no idea. All of that today is out in there in the public domain pretty much, right? So I think the one thing around mission and vision statements is if there's a purpose statement that an organization is going to tag itself with, be ready to be challenged, because those employees know, don't put that out there when you don't pay your taxes in 3 countries across the world. Yeah, it's happening, right? You get these big highfalutin statements. And I think the one thing that the lower generations are happy to do is say, we know you're not doing that. Whereas maybe in my generation's a little bit more like, okay, like cut them some slack. It's a big corporate world. It's tough out there. And we've got VCs and investors behind us chewing at our tails. So I think the younger generations are really, really good at calling it out when they smell it. And I love that.
Yeah, I do too.
Yes.
All right.
I was going to say, we usually say that Gen Z has a strong BS filter.
Yeah.
Very true. All right, our final question. So what strategies can leaders employ to maximize productivity, especially in a context where different generations may have different approaches to work? And Tim, I'll have you take us away on this one.
Productivity, I think, is a tough one, right? Because first of all, there is no universal measure of productivity. So that's the first thing. We can't, until somebody comes up with an amazing solution for how we universally measure it, I think we've got to actually just track it back a little bit. So if you take my area of expertise is on the physical and the virtual work environment itself from an infrastructure perspective. First and foremost, what the employer has got to do is understand the role of the employee at a really detailed level and give them everything they need to be awesome in their role, right? Because it doesn't matter how long that list could be, it is still a fraction of the cost of the employee. Right? The recruitment cost for an average employee anywhere in the developed world is still more than the cost of providing them with the infrastructure. So provide them with every single tool, trick, ecosystem, you name it. I don't care what it is. Give them everything that they could possibly need to be awesome in their role. And if your hiring strategy is right, if your talent strategy is right, and if your management development program is right, your learning and development program, you'll have an amazing outcome.
Great point. Maya, what about you?
Yeah, Tim stole the words right out of my mouth. I 110% agree that it's better to prepare and arm the team that you have than to sort of start from scratch. And I feel too often, sometimes folks just want to throw up their hands because maybe folks aren't feeling inspired or feeling engaged in their role. But I think kind of bringing it back to Tim's idea about purpose, I think one, having a mission and then embodying value-based decision making based off of that mission is something that can help aid in showing your employee what the value in their role is. The concept of like value-based decision making sort of being like this guiding principle where you're making decisions based off of the values that you set within the organization to sort of show that there's not this subjective, arbitrary way of doing things, but then also laddering up why that employee is important in this overall mission, why that employee is important in this overall plan. That's something that we have actively done a lot of work at Juve specifically, or formerly Juve, now NextGen. And it does take work. People management is managing people for sure, but we do see that there's a greater sense of value that folks have when they understand why they're doing what they're doing. And I will say that this generation is more keen to asking why. Some other generations maybe aren't asking why and simply do the work because they know that it's a job, and maybe that why isn't something that matters or something that they're conditioned to ask for. But this generation is certainly asking why. Well, why do I have to do this? Well, why does that make sense? Well, how does this ladder up to the success of the business, right? And we have found that when you're breaking that down and showing them why the work that they're doing is valuable, has definitely helped in sort of increasing engagement with them.
So all those managers who've got children at home, they should go and get the Taming the Toddler book off the bookcase, yeah, and reread that for their employee.
A little bit. Yeah. And I do tell people that, like, when we talk about kids, I don't have kids, but when we talk about kids and we talk about this idea of like, don't do it as I say, but do as I do, that doesn't necessarily work with your kids, so it's not going to work with your employees. And also this idea of like highway signs, like there are multiple signs because you usually miss one and you usually miss two, so you're going to also have to repeat what you're saying to your employees more than once. So yeah, you might be right, Tim. That book might be helpful.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for the advice, and thank you for the wonderful insights that you've shared today. I'm going to have to go look for that book on my bookshelf. But it's fascinating. For the first time in history, there might be 5 separate and distinct generations that we're working with, and raising this awareness can really help, bridge the gap between these generations and allow us to learn from one another, which I think is critical. And to the point that we've talked about throughout this call, have purpose and understand and know the purpose. So I hope that everyone enjoyed the panel discussion today. We thank you all for joining, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much to Christy, and a special thanks to Maya and Tim for sharing your stories with us. Tim's perspective on how a person's life and career stage can be more accurate in determining their workplace needs rather than their birth year alone was fascinating. Maybe a message to leadership that a bit of empathy with your employee's life stage and flexibility could go a long way. Now, while younger generations may be more comfortable with multi-channel communication, they could improve by mirroring older generations' communication styles to ensure workplace professionalism. We all need to adapt communication styles based on the context and audience. Lastly, organizations must clearly define their purpose to engage and motivate employees. And understanding what motivates each generation of employees is crucial to increasing productivity. I really liked Christy's 5 love languages of the workplace as a resource for understanding individual motivations. I mean, who knew there were love languages for the workplace? As we near the end, I'd like to introduce an additional topic that's top of mind for many organizations: hybrid work. Tim Oldman will dive into hybrid work trends, office adjustments, and strategies to optimize productivity in the workplace.
I am thrilled to welcome back Tim Oldman from Leesman Index to do a lightning round on the emerging data highlighting the purpose-driven motivations behind flexible work arrangements. Today, we have 3 key areas we'd like to dive into. So Tim, what part does place really play in the employee experience? What strategies are you seeing companies employ to prevent wasted office time and maximize productivity? And what impact do you think flexible work arrangements have on employee satisfaction, retention, and overall well-being? Let's dive into it.
Well, as you know, Christy, I could talk about this all afternoon, so let's just try and condense it into as quick a time as we can. One of the earliest pieces of research that we found as we started to emerge from the pandemic was a trend that we call purposeful presence. So this idea of purpose is really important. But what we found is that employees are being intentional and much more planful about when they attend the office, because they now have experienced the idea of doing so many more things remote. For a period, we did everything remotely. And so now, in terms of the sort of the tidal flow back to workplace, to the corporate workplace, the employee is being much more sort of thoughtful about the things that the corporate space supports best, and the thing that actually, for many employees, the home supports best. And we know from the research that the average knowledge worker is supported better in the average home than they are in the average workplace. So in a sense, like, average is no longer good enough for corporate workplace. And I think this talks to that sort of the middle question, really, in terms of the strategies that some of the leading companies that we're working with are deploying, because it really is that sort of sense of there now being a competitive market, not in terms of the risk of an employee going somewhere else to a different employer, but actually the employee staying at home. Because the corporate workplace that they've created for themselves in that super personalized environment at home is a pretty attractive place for lots of things that a knowledge worker does in their knowledge day. And so I think the clients that are exceeding are those that are seeing almost like they've got to up the game. They've actually got to play in that competitive marketplace, so that when an employee sets their alarm on their phone of an evening for the following morning, do they set it for 6 a.m. to be in the office for 8:30 a.m.? Or do they set it for 8 a.m. to be downstairs at their desk in their spare bedroom for 8:30 a.m.? And I think that's what the leading clients are really adopting, that idea of the competitive marketplace. What's the draw? How do you earn the commute? How do you get people into a workplace so that the employee can be the ideal version of themselves in their role, by giving them the infrastructure, the resources, the spaces, the amenities, the food and beverage offers that really make that the more attractive space to be, along with their colleagues. And we've seen so many chief executives, CFOs, CEOs, CHROs getting themselves into deep water in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, in the Financial Times about the latest mandate. I think the leading companies in that middle question, what they're doing is saying, let's develop a workplace experience that's so good, our CEO or our CFO never has to issue a memo that defines how often people are going to use workplace. And I think if you think about it in that sort of strand, that's where the best work is being done. So in terms of the impact of flexible work arrangements, I think this is where we've empowered the employee to be more mindful and more thoughtful about that sort of those choices and optionalities that are available to them. And I think for very many employees that we speak to, we converse with, and we hear back from through the survey techniques, clearly there is benefit in the flexibility. The balancing of work and life is clearly easier if there is some elasticity into time choice and location choice. But within that, I think most organizations that we're around at the moment are helping the employee by defining some guardrails, and they're pretty elastic in the best examples. But I think there have to be some guidelines, there have to be some sort of perimeter markers for that, because I think otherwise we all become contractors. We all just sort of start living our own lives, contributing individually rather than contributing collectively. And that's where I think the best work is being done, in reinforcing the value of common purpose. And for many pieces of our workday, the value in common purpose, or achieving a common purpose, is definitely best achieved together. But regrettably, many workplaces don't support the other bit of work, the focused individual work, the deep dive work. And that's where homes are winning at the moment. So I'd like to see more employers, more design firms, more architects thinking much more acutely about the nature of modern knowledge work, because it's tough, it's deep, it's hard, and it's focused.
Tim, thank you. It's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about the competitive nature of this, of really remote versus office versus your employee going elsewhere. So Tim, thinking about this, what happens when some people come into the office and some don't? You expected to see some, and then they weren't there and they ended up being remote. How are companies coping with that?
We're in an experiment, Christian. I think everybody's trying to work that out as we go along, and I think maybe it's part of the delight and the disappointment of days in office, and it's something we're going to have to get used to. Or maybe it's something, per the research, the purposeful presence, where rather than it being an individual purposeful decision and a planful decision, we have to start getting a little bit more collective in our planning and start to think about those people for whom we think being present together has value versus those that perhaps don't need to be present. And we're more intentional then about communicating the value, the benefit, and the needs of being co-located versus those that are, dialing in remote. Not forgetting, of course, that almost every large enterprise that I work has people working in multiple regions, multiple territories. And in terms of all of our interest in reducing carbon, reducing travel to and from a workplace has its benefits as well. So I think this is just something we're going to have to work through, develop some guardrails and some communication techniques around it, and help organizations navigate their way through.
Absolutely. We're working with those large corporations and enterprises to help them as well. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Throughout our discussions today, we've explored the intersection of culture, engagement, AI, and technology. We've witnessed firsthand how technology can enhance team collaboration and navigate the complexities of a multi-generational workforce. As we wrap up, let's take what we've learned here to cultivate a workplace culture that maximizes digital experiences to engage and empower employees. I want to send a special shout out to our event sponsors, PwC, D10, HP Poly, Jabra, Logitech, and Neat. It was an honor having you here with us today. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you at the next Work Transformation Summit.